It's honestly one of the most massive paradoxes in human history. I mean, how exactly did a damp, relatively small island nation in the North Atlantic manage to build the absolute largest empire the world has ever seen? It's a staggering story of exploration, trade, and just total global rewiring. In this explainer, we're going to dive into the precise mechanics of how this tiny piece of geography expanded to touch every corner of the Earth, fundamentally shaping the modern world as we know it today. At its height, the British Empire controlled 1/4 of the Earth's land and people. The sun literally never set on its territory. By the 1920s, that wasn't just some poetic metaphor, right? Daylight was literally always touching its borders somewhere on the globe. But no empire lasts forever, and understanding exactly how this immense structure was built is really the only way to truly understand why it ultimately fell apart.
It is just staggering when you break the numbers down. They governed roughly 20 to 25% of the entire global population. We're talking about absolute dominance, stretching across Europe, Asia, Africa, the Americas, and Australia. The sheer logistics of maintaining control over such a massive, completely disconnected landmass from one central island. It's a total masterclass in aggressive strategy and ruthless efficiency.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. 1. An island becomes an empire. 2. The corporate conquest. 3. The sun never sets. 4. The cracks begin to show. And finally, 5. The final collapse. Let's get right into it.
Part 1. An island becomes an empire. It all starts with geographic advantage.
You know the old saying, geography is destiny? Well, for Britain, being an island provided this incredible natural fortress. Think about mainland European powers for a second, like France or Germany. They had to constantly pour vast fortunes and manpower into maintaining massive land armies, literally just to defend their borders from neighboring invasions. But Britain, they were protected by the English Channel. So instead of funding endless armies, they poured immense wealth into timber, sails, and cannons for the Royal Navy. This supreme naval force allowed them to utterly dominate global trade routes, and what's really fascinating is that even when they suffered the massive, humiliating loss of their American colonies in 1783, this naval supremacy let them rapidly pivot. They just shifted their gaze eastward, using their unchallenged fleets to start claiming territories across Asia, Africa, and Australia.
All right, moving on to Part 2. The Corporate Conquest, starring the East India Company.
Normally, when we think about empires expanding, we picture conquering armies and ambitious kings, right? But the subjugation of India, it literally began in a boardroom. In 1599, just 125 private shareholders got together in London. They pooled their money, formed the East India Company, and secured a royal monopoly. A corporation was about to conquer a nation. It is wild to even think about today, but this private business actually possessed its own private military. It minted its own currency, and it operated with absolute impunity, thousands of miles away from those original shareholders.
And the sheer scale of the extraction that followed is frankly hard to even wrap your head around. Economic historians estimate that a staggering $45 trillion, yes, trillion with a T, was systematically siphoned from India's wealth over nearly 2 centuries. To put that into perspective, this essentially bankrolled Britain's entire industrial revolution. It paid for their factories, their infrastructure, and the global military campaigns of the empire. But at the same time, it completely bankrupted a once thriving Indian economy that had previously held a massive share of the global GDP.
So you've got to ask, how does a single corporation actually swallow an entire subcontinent? Well, it was a creeping, incredibly calculated playbook. First, they show up as humble merchants, using gifts and diplomacy to gain trading rights from the powerful Mughal empires. Second, under the guise of simply protecting their silk and spices, they started building fortified trading posts. Third, as the Mughal Empire inevitably weakened, they exploited local political rivalries, essentially backing opportunistic factions. The real defining moment was the 1757 Battle of Plassey, where the company actually backed a rival commander to overthrow the local leader. And then comes step 4, the ultimate corporate hostile takeover. Once they installed their puppet rulers, the East India Company took direct control of the local tax revenues. They literally collected taxes from Indian citizens and then used that exact money to buy Indian goods, exporting them back to Europe for pure, unregulated profit.
Which brings us to Part 3. The sun never sets. This is peak global dominance.
Governing a quarter of the globe is no small feat, and it required a very distinct two-tiered administrative system. On one side, you had dominions like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. These were established largely by white British settlers, and they enjoyed significant autonomy and political freedom. They could pass their own laws and manage their own domestic affairs, all while still flying the British flag.
But on the flip side were the crown colonies, places like Kenya, Jamaica, and Hong Kong. These territories were placed under strict, direct rule by British-appointed governors, and their primary economic function was the ruthless extraction of vital raw materials, cash crops, and incredibly cheap labor to continually enrich the home nation. Now, it's absolutely crucial to understand the dual reality of this massive global machine. All that extreme, unprecedented wealth piling up in London, it was directly fueled by extreme hardship abroad. The empire relied heavily on deeply oppressive systems, essentially substituting outlawed slavery with vast networks of indentured laborers working in horrific conditions for fractions of a penny. Furthermore, these top-down colonial policies frequently triggered staggering humanitarian disasters. The historical record clearly highlights the 1943 Bengal famine as a devastating example. Up to 3 million people died of starvation and disease, a tragedy heavily exacerbated by British colonial policies that exported vital grain away from the starving local population to stockpile reserves for the World War II effort.
That leads us into part 4. The cracks begin to show and the immense cost of global war.
You see, the collapse of the empire wasn't some slow, graceful fade. It was accelerated incredibly fast by the two world wars. World War I drained the nation's youth and its treasury, costing over 600,000 British lives and burning through a massive 25% of their GDP. It forced the UK into crippling debt. And then, World War II effectively bankrupted the British economy entirely. Literally overnight, Britain transformed from being the world's largest creditor to its biggest debtor. To even survive, Britain had to heavily extract food, labor, and millions of soldiers from its colonies. But here is the profound irony that ultimately broke the empire. You simply can't ask millions of people to fight and die for global freedom and democracy while simultaneously denying those exact things to them at home. The demands for independence became definite.
But beyond the sheer financial ruin, there was also a profound psychological collapse. During World War II, Japan rapidly swept through British territories in Asia, and when the supposedly impenetrable fortress of Singapore fell to the Japanese in 1942, Winston Churchill himself called it the greatest capitulation in British history. As regional leaders noted at the time, seeing the British so easily defeated completely shattered the long-held myth of European invincibility. For the colonial subjects, the illusion was gone. They realized the British were not an unstoppable force, and those psychological chains of the empire were broken forever.
And that brings us to our final section, Part 5, the final collapse and rapid decolonization. The post-war unraveling happened stunningly fast. In 1947, the so-called Jewel in the Crown, India, achieved independence, triggering a massive geopolitical domino effect. Then came the ultimate reality check, the 1956 Suez Crisis. Britain attempted to use military force to retake the Suez Canal in Egypt, but they faced immense, immediate international backlash. Severe economic and political pressure from both the United Nations and the United States forced Britain to humiliatingly withdraw. This singular event proved to the entire globe that the rules of the world had officially changed. Britain was no longer a superpower capable of dictating terms. Decolonization rapidly accelerated across Africa and the Caribbean, symbolically ending with the handover of Hong Kong back to China in 1997.
So the physical empire may have disintegrated, retreating back to the borders of that damp island in the North Atlantic, but make no mistake, it fundamentally rewired our globe. It shaped the global dominance of the English language. It drew modern international borders, and it firmly established the complex framework for international corporate trade. So I want to leave you with this thought. The sun has finally set on the empire's territories, but when you look closely at modern global wealth and power dynamics, who ultimately benefited and who is still paying the price? Thanks for exploring this with me.